Hey, welcome back to my video series on Learning Maya for Beginners. Today, we're going to talk about cameras. We've started into kind of this texturing, looking at shaders and lighting, and we can't really talk more about rendering if we're not going to talk about cameras. So if you look in your outliner, you'll see these little camera icons in each of your views. So if you're just in a perspective view like I am right now, you're technically already using a camera. So you have to remember that this program, this software, tries to simulate real life. So if we're looking at something, we have to be looking at it through something else. But we don't want to use these defaults when we're doing renders. So I'm going to create a new camera. Just so you know, I've just got a scene, modeled a little USB cable here. I did a backdrop and put a color on here, just a plain kind of brown shader. And then for lighting, right now I'm just going to use an HDRI. So if you don't know what this is, if you'd like to know what this is, in my last video on lighting, towards the end, you can see how to create one of these, apply one of these. And basically what this is going to do is cast light from the actual image itself. So I'm going to get some, warmer lights out of this, some cooler tones out of this. And it just kind of helps if you don't have a whole scene like this. It's going to give us more realistic reflections out of metallic pieces, and overall just help with realism. So to create a camera, I'm going to go up to Create, Cameras, and choose Camera. Now just so you know, you'll have options. Camera and Aim means that you can put kind of a marker exactly where you want this to aim. And Up controls how the camera is going to be set up and down. But we're just going to do a plain old camera. So you'll see it places this little camera icon into your scene. I like leaving these the default scale. I've noticed if you scale these, it can cause some issues with some of your settings. And I think there's proper ways to do that, but honestly, from what I've noticed, the default tends to do everything I need it to do. So we want to look through the camera so that we can actually see what this camera is seeing. So in order to do this, if I have it selected, I can go to Panels and then just look through Selected, or for my perspective view, which is where I am right now, I can switch over to my camera 1. Now one thing I like to do is rename these. I'm going to call this Shot Cam. So you want to make sure you know what your cameras are actually doing, and I'm going to get some good framing. Now, I like to turn on my resolution gate, which is this little button here. This will show me that what actually is going to be rendered, because you'll see that there's a lot of this that gets cut out. So you want to make sure that you are rendering what you intend to render. So I'm going to kind of just cut off this tail end over here maybe. And something like this, get it sort of on the thirds. Okay, so we want to talk about some settings of our camera. Just like a normal camera that has a lens and that can zoom in and out, we have the ability to do those things with this camera. So we have angle of view and we have focal length. Focal length is one of the main things you're probably going to be adjusting. So if you aren't aware, on a normal camera, focal length, this number is usually in millimeters. So you'll have a lens that will say, 20 millimeter lens, or maybe a lens that it goes from 18 millimeter to 50 or 55 millimeters, something like that. Essentially, this is how zoomed in or out you are. But what you need to note is the smaller this number is, the wider lens you're going to get. So if you've seen wide angle lenses, something like a GoPro, where it's extremely wide, you start getting some kind of distortion. So I want to illustrate what that actually is going to do. I'm going to go really small with this. I'm going to change this to 10. You'll see that it makes it look like we're further away. The camera has not actually moved. The camera is in the exact same position that it was before, but our lens is way wider, which lets us see, of course, more of our scene. And as I dolly in, you'll see that this starts really showing what that distortion is doing, where some of this, isn't distorting as much towards the center of the frame, but then we really see that distortion towards the side. Now, this is used for a lot of reasons. It's kind of hard to really talk about it without showing examples. So what I recommend doing is when you are watching animations, when you're watching movies, try to see if you can see interesting choices with kind of these focal lengths. Now I'm going to go the opposite direction here and go to 200. So in this case, this is a zoom lens, which means I do have to move my camera back in order to actually see this. And now you're going to see kind of the opposite, where it's sort of squishing this all together. So what you're doing with the focal length is going to make a pretty big difference for what this final render is going to look like. So just to give you an example, sorry for the super pixelated image here, but just to give you an example of what effect you can kind of start getting by playing around with these different focal lengths. This, of course, would not be possible without adjusting that value to get kind of this extra depth where the distortion isn't so much here, but this gun looks huge, absolutely massive on the screen in her hands. This is the type of thing, and you'll see kind of at the end here is where we're starting to really sort of bow these lines where they don't belong. So this is the type of thing that you can do. So you want to think about in all of your shots what this focal length is actually doing for you. Now the next thing I want to look at, there is a whole lot more that we can do here, and really my best advice is to just go look up what all of these settings can do. Maya will have all of these settings listed out, and visually they tend to put pictures in to describe kind of what changing these things are going to do. But I want to go down to the Arnold tab and talk a little bit about the depth of field. So if I click on this Enable DOF, I'm going to first turn this off and just show you a render, just so you can see what we're actually getting here. So I'll skip ahead until this render is complete. Okay, so I've got a finished render here. Now this is just showing off the lighting. I've got the quality settings a little high, so it was a kind of a slow render. I should turn those down while I'm, of course, making changes to what camera's doing, what lighting is doing. So what I want to really point out here is everything right now is ultimately in focus. So this metal piece, this plastic piece, the cable all the way back into this distance is in focus. So what we want to do with this depth of field is create the effect where some of this is going to be in focus while some of this is not in focus. Now, in order for this to work, we need an aperture size. So I'm going to start something, let's just do, maybe I'll just drag this over a little bit. Probably around this 0.05. You want to start small with this aperture size. Now, this focus distance is going to be wrong right now. Focus distance is basically saying how far away is your camera from this object or whatever point you want to be in focus. So I'm going to do another render just so you can see what happens when I turn on my depth of field, but I don't actually fix or change what this focus distance is doing. So let's hit another render here and I'll be right back. And by the magic of editing, we have a finished render. So this whole thing now is out of focus. So this is kind of what I wanted to show you. What this focus is going to do, this depth of field is going to do, is create places where something is in and out of focus. But we need to figure out where this should be in focus. So to do this, I need to turn on my object details. So if you come up to display, heads up display, and turn on your object details, you'll see you have one that says distance from camera. Now, I don't have anything selected, so I don't really have a distance that can actually give me any information worth any value. But if I select this metal piece, maybe this is what I want to be most in focus, you'll see it says 36.097. So I just want to memorize what this number is, 36.097. And if I want to go back to my attribute editor for my camera, I can just select the camera here, or of course I could select this over in my outliner. So I'm going to put in 36.097. You can be as specific as you want, or you can round a little bit and it probably won't make too much difference. But now that should say that the distance where it is going to be in focus is the same distance as this object was away from my camera. So let's go ahead and do one more render here to see what that did for us. So as you can see in our finished render, we now have this in focus, but we're not getting too much of the effect. So that means that our aperture size could be adjusted here to get a little bit more noticeable effect. It's starting to get a little bit kind of blurred out back here. So I'm going to crank this up a little. Let's just do 0.3. I think that should be visible. And apparently I lied. We're going to do one more render and maybe more after that. So now that we have another render done, you can see this part is still in focus, but it is more noticeable how we're getting out of focus kind of the depth of this picture. So this can really enhance the realism of some of your renders. I do want to warn you, just kind of let you know that a lot of times this depth of field is done in a different software. It's done after the renders have been completed in post. It kind of depends on the pipeline workflow that a specific company is going to use. But if you do want to capture this in Arnold rendering, this is how you do it. You do have more controls, you know, the aperture blades, the curvature, the rotation, and you can go look up what all of these do as well. And just to note, if you're in your render settings, the camera AA is going to be what controls the quality of that blur effect, that depth of field that it's doing. So if you notice a lot of noise, grain, pixelation, whatever, it's ultimately going to be this camera AA, the anti-aliasing, that will affect this. So unfortunately, this usually means that because you have to crank this one up higher, you are going to get much slower renders when you use this, which might be part of the reason a lot of people do this in post, because they probably can do it faster in some other options, other software options. So that's all I really wanted to cover with cameras, just to get the basics so you understand how to create one, name one, and adjust some of the settings to get an image that you can be satisfied with when you are doing your renders. So I will see you next time.